Welcome everybody to the last Online Peace Science Colloquium meeting of the fall of 2017. It's 2017. I'm Emily Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and I'm the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. Today we have a presentation from Zachary Steinert-Threlkeld, and he's an assistant professor of public policy at the University of California, Los Angeles, at the Luskin School of Public Affairs. And he's going to be giving us an excellent presentation today on a variety of things. And we are joined today by four lovely discussants who have read this paper and are going to give us great comments on it. We have Charles Crabtree, who's a PhD student at the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. We have Arthur Spirling, an associate professor of politics and data science at New York University. Camber is an assistant professor at the Department of Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. And Elaine Denny is an assistant professor of political science. She will be joining the faculty at the University of California, Merced next year and is currently a postdoc researcher at the Development Lab at Duke University. So thank you all for joining us today, and we're going to start with a short presentation from Zach, and then we will be opening up for comments.
Great. All right. Thanks, Emily, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for giving your attention to my new work. So I'm going to share my screen now, step through my presentation. The presentation, is designed to be longer, so I'll kind of be skipping around slides. And hopefully it doesn't get too confusing. All right, so here's my screen. Okay, you guys can see the screen. Can someone just confirm that you're seeing my slides?
Yes.
With no,
yes, yeah. Everything's good. Sorry, we all nodded.
I can't see y'all, so I need someone to say yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right, great. So, I'm presenting today my first main batch of work post-dissertation, and I thought I'd give you a little bit of just the intellectual background of how I came to it before diving into the main stuff, and I need to pay my HOA tomorrow. So my original research is about the Arab Spring and mobilization and the role of social influence on the decision to protest. And I analyzed that using social media data from Twitter and then events data from both IQs and GDEL. And one thing that I kept noticing is that really these processes, both on the social network side and on the protest side, are dominated by these fat tail events. That if you look at the correlations of variables, they don't really correlate except for like the top 50% of events, or sometimes even the top 30% of events. And I was trying to figure out exactly where this would come from, why, if it would hurt my models, any implications for my models. But I never really got the chance to address it then. I also noticed, as I was learning about diffusion on networks and reading kind of the statistical physics literature, that they're really interested in scale-free distributions or scale-free networks, depending on who phrases it. And what that means is that just the way to influence, the way centrality in the network is distributed follows a certain pattern that is different than what's called a random network. So not distributed like a normal curve or even like a Poisson distribution, but according to this scale-free distribution. And then so over the spring quarter and summer, once I finished teaching and class preps were done and I had some time to sit down and read and start thinking about this, I started reading more, looking at data more, and this paper is one of the first outgrowths of that. And so the basic argument I want to make in this paper, well, there are two basic arguments. The first, on the modeling side, is that I think the fat tail nature of the distribution of protests is driven by the fat tail nature of influence in a social network. If we think that there is a large social component to protesting, you gather information from people in your network, there's safety in numbers, well then perhaps there's some connection between the distribution of influence in a network, and then the distribution of sizes of protests, of how many people protest. And then how many protests are very big and how many protests are very small. So half of the paper is about building that model, or starting to build that model. And then I also empirically show implication, or I empirically provide what I hope is convincing proof that certainly for protests, and maybe even for other kinds of contentious politics, we see evidence of fat tail distributions. And so I'll go into a little more detail now briefly exactly what I mean by that. I'm going to skip over this long and short time frame dynamics stuff, and just in the interest of time, but I go into more work on that in the paper. So it's not new to say that something has large tail events, that there are some very large events and very small events. We have plenty of distributions that can account for this. The exponential family of distributions is a whole class of distributions, like the Poisson or even the normal, that can have fat tails. And if you were to look at just like a PDF of these distributions of a power law, exponential, and log normal, it would seem like they all pretty quickly converge to the same probability estimates for tail events, right? As we get to small events. So phenomena, I think size of the event, and of course, the scaling doesn't really matter, 10, 20, 1,000, 20,000, whatever. It looks like we're predicting the same probability for an event. But in fact, in these tails, the power law assigns a much higher probability to these rare events than exponential or log normal distributions, which quite quickly assume that very large events won't even happen. So here I'm showing you a log-log plot where the y-axis is 1 minus the cumulative distribution function. And the key takeaway from this is that the straight line, the power law relationship, is much higher than the exponential log normal. It's assigned much higher probability to these big events, and that it's flat over the range of the size of the phenomena, right? So the exponential and log normal are telling you that as you get bigger, the probability of getting even bigger becomes smaller and smaller, right? But the log normal is telling you, or I'm sorry, the power law is telling you that an event of this size, 10 to the 1, is as likely to grow to 10 to the 2 as one from 10 to the 2 is likely to grow from 10 to the 3. So the probability of going from a medium-sized event to a very large event, or a medium-sized event to a very small event, or a very small event to a medium-sized event is constant regardless of the size of the event in question. And that's why people call it scale-free, that these probabilities don't vary as a function of the scale, the size of the phenomena. Okay, so power law can give us better estimates of tails. Do we just have to have a different functional form for our model, and we can go on from there? Well, it turns out that there are some significant implications for the mean of a distribution and the variance of a distribution that follows a power law. So the slope of the power law is described as alpha, right? So the slope of the line, when people write the distribution, is given as negative alpha. And if alpha is between 2 and 3, that means your distribution does not have a stable variance. Statisticians will say it has an infinite variance. What that means is that as we get more and more data, our estimation of the variance changes and can even approach affinity. It never settles on a stable estimate for the variance of our distribution. We could, however, have a stable mean if alpha is between 2 and 3. If, however, alpha is between 1 and 2, then we have both an infinite mean and infinite variance. And most of the statistics that we're taught in school assume a stable mean and stable variance, right? We need the standard errors to be the same as we gather more data, or the inferences we make on statistical significance are going to be invalid going forward, right? We can always make some inference on the data on our sample, but we could get more data and our standard error is going to totally blow up, or our estimates of effect size are going to totally blow up as well. If, however, alpha is greater than 3, then you have a log normal world. So this alpha greater than 3, the slope is very steep. The influence of these tail events doesn't change your estimate of mean or variance as you get more events. So this estimate of the slope can tell us whether we can use the standard statistical tools or not to summarize and make statistical models of the data that we have. So there are a whole bunch of ways to estimate whether you have a power law or not. I'll skip over that. There's more detail in the paper, of course. So to try to figure out the mechanisms of this power law, to find out where it comes from in protests, I've, with the help of my co-author, started to build a series of network models. We've only completed the first stage now, but we instantiate a network. We give every node a threshold of 20%. You need 20% of your connections to participate in a protest for you to protest. We randomly activate a node and all the nodes to whom it's connected. So you can think of that as like the students protesting or the journalists protesting or the labor unions protesting. So we activate them, and then we look at who they're connected to, and we see if those nodes connect. And we go on for 1,000 trials, and we look at the distribution of the size of activated nodes at the end of the trial. You know, eventually you reach a steady state where maybe no nodes are activated, almost all the nodes are activated, or something in between. And so you basically get, you know, it stops unless you get above about 1,000 nodes, and then it tips. You know, this is a threshold model, so eventually you reach some critical point where it tips and everybody diffuses. We set up the distribution of node of influence in the network to be 2.3. It's well known that in social networks, online and offline, the scaling relationship of degree is 2.3, or sorry, it's between 2 and 3. I went to Twitter to see what the scaling relationship there is, and it's 2.3. So we instantiated the network with the degree distribution of 2.3, and we get the scaling parameter of about of almost 1.3. Notice though that not very many of the trials result in this full diffusion. So full diffusion is still the exception and not the rule, which is fine. That's what it is in real life. Emily, how am I doing on time? I see it's 9:10 over here.
Sorry, 4 minutes.
4 minutes left? Great. Okay. So we can look at the size of the final diffusion for each trial, how many nodes were activated, as it varies by certain network features. And the takeaway from these next 3 plots is that you can get full activation of the network regardless of these initial network features that we've looked at. So the density of the neighborhood could be 0, so all the nodes that are activated are not very well connected to each other, or it could be 1, they're all very well connected to each other, and you still can get small diffusions or very large diffusions. The same is true, but in reverse for clustering. It looks like if there's no clustering, most of the time you're going to get small diffusions, but you can get big diffusions, but you'll still see mass diffusion across the distribution of the clustering coefficient. The initial size of the neighborhood is a little different in that, you know, if we happen to trigger a very large neighborhood, we're almost certainly going to get a large diffusion. But nonetheless, we see when the initial mobilizers are small in number, you can quite often have large diffusions nonetheless. Most of the time, you won't have large diffusions. These dots are, you know, the 1,000 minus 194 small diffusions. Well, yeah. But of the large diffusions, most are still happening when the initial set of mobilizers is very small. You may have noticed, and we've started to look at this, just didn't have time to put in the presentation, the variance of the outcome of the final diffusion does change across initial density and clustering, but the main takeaway is still the same, that you can have complete diffusion at any network any local topographical feature seems to be able to cause a large diffusion event. So let me go to the empirical tool quickly. So then what I did is I said, okay, well, there's this model. We seem to be getting at some underlying mechanism. Let's see if data on actual protest events substantiates a power law relationship, or if we're in a log normal world. And so what I did was I said, well, if we're in a log normal world, I should be able to take the sample of my data and then just see if the central limit theorem holds. Let me look at the sample mean and the sample variance. And if I see approximately a bell curve, I haven't run any distributional tests, I'm just visualizing right now. But if it looks like a bell curve, then we're going to be in a normal or log normal world. I always log, so really a log normal world. And if we don't, then we're in this greater skew world. And so here, this graph is showing you the size of protest, the number of protestees at the Women's March protest in January of this year, and then taking samples and calculating the variance of that sample. And you can see we don't have a nice normal distribution. If you were to look at the mean, which I've done but don't show here, then it would be normally distributed. The mean is normally distributed, so this suggests a scaling exponent between 2 and 3.
2 minutes.
Thank you. If we go to the IQ's data, so this is a machine-coded data set that counts certain events across the world by day. I gathered these data for the Arab Spring. We see the percent change in protest does not appear to be normally distributed for variance. It is for mean. I've done percent change so that we can easily compare, countries with a lot of protests to countries with not many protests. Large countries are going to have just a higher absolute number of protests than small countries. But so this percent change appears to have an infinite variance as well. I've then started to investigate whether we might see this power law relationship in other data as well. And so in the paper, I go through various data sets, and here I'm just going to show a couple of the data sets. I looked at Bethany Lucina's Civil War data. She's collected data on the severity of civil war, and I just resampled it. To me, this looks like the mean has the second high peak. So I'm guessing that the alpha is less than 2 for civil wars. For the UCDP's global event data set, the mean is bimodal as well. It doesn't seem to settle around a stable value. For the global terrorism data set, the variance has this similar lack of adherence to the CLT, and the mean does appear to follow the CLT. So it looks like it scales with an alpha between 2 to 3. And so now I'm in the summary of what I've told you, and then I discuss some implications for how we think about protest, what we can model, how we can test it, how this might explain some autocratic behavior. And then at the very end, I talk about, well, maybe there's some universal mechanism going on if we think that power law describes not just the distribution of protest severity, but also the distribution of terrorism severity and civil war severity as well. As Camber Warren knows, there's a lot of work out there that shows that interstate mobilization follows a power law as well. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Zach. And now I want to remind anybody who's watching that Zachary and Shane's paper is on the Online Peace Science Colloquium website if you want to take a look at it. And with that, I'll open it up for anyone who wants to get started.
Yeah, very nice.
Okay, Camber.
So first of all, I want to say I think this is a really fascinating paper. I completely agree that we need more research on these sorts of heavy-tailed distributions. They're ubiquitous in social phenomena. We need more papers like this, so big thumbs up on that. So what I want to think more about, though, are what's sufficient evidence for concluding that a particular mechanism underlies this power law. If I'm a little skeptical of the claim towards the end of the paper that there's a universal theory of conflict because we see power laws across these different forms of conflict. Because we also see power across non-social phenomena. We see power laws in earthquake sizes. We see power laws in epileptic seizures. We see power laws in protein interaction networks. And we don't believe that earthquakes are caused by the same thing as protein interaction networks. So just because we see power laws in two phenomenon, I don't think gives us necessarily an inference that those two phenomena are linked. As power laws are in a lot of phenomenon. If there is a linkage, it would seem to have to be something really fundamental and abstract, that's so fundamental and abstract that it could apply across all of these very different systems. So some kind of notion of like the fundamental nature of positive feedback, for instance, I think could be very fundamental here. But it would have to be something very generic like that to be a unified theory of all power laws.
Yeah, I think a unified theory is too ambitious for one paper. You know, but it's a nice way to try to get it in paper just to demonstrate initially that this might be more widely applicable. But I hear you and I agree.
Arthur, and then I have Elaine with a one finger next.
So let me push a little bit on this. What's going on in this paper, right? So let's suppose that we grant, and you know, per Camber's comments and your comments, that indeed there is a class of distributions which fits some data that we have in the world better than some other class of distributions, right? So in your case, you believe that power law distribution fits better than a Gaussian or some other class of distribution. So the question for me immediately, from an empirical perspective, is sort of how much better, right? So that is, what conclusions are we drawing incorrectly in the rest of social science if we don't use this other class of distributions? And this leads to a broader critique of this type of work, which is that we know all models are wrong, but we use them because they're useful in some sense. So of course we don't even really believe that heights are perfectly normally distributed, right? And in particular, we think that we're unlikely to observe people who are 9 foot tall. In fact, they never exist. But the normal would say that that should be a non-zero event, right? We should sometimes see that. And I guess I'm very interested to know what your answer to that would be. So I can merrily go off and use some Gaussian distribution to model the riots or the protests or whatever it is that I'm interested in. And how wrong will that be, right? What will in fact be incorrect? Will I draw substantive conclusions which are actively wrong? I.e., will I believe that this particular thing leads to more of a protest than it doesn't? What is going to be corrected by using a sort of power law model? And then I'll have something very specific to say about the way that we think about modeling in social science, statistical modeling, but I'd be curious to hear your response to that.
Zach.
Yeah. Thanks, Arthur. No, I completely hear you, and that's kind of the main thing that I've been thinking about the last month or two since I completed the first draft that y'all have seen. So I need to go back and kind of like perform robustness checks on all these papers and see, well, if we look at different, kind of do cross-validation of the data and see if we get different results based on including these large events or not. Practically speaking, I can tell you from personal experience modeling, our models then do not capture the causes of large protests or then the causes of protests to die in any like sudden movement. We can capture these like small percolations in protest size, but then when January 25th becomes January 28th and it doubles in size, but then by 7 days later, they've, I don't want to say almost died, but they're like 20 or 30% as large. It's very hard to model that with these distributions that don't allow for these really big swings. Now, whether that then changes our inference on the underlying causal process is something I still need to explore, right? So just because we can't predict the big upswing or downswing doesn't mean that maybe complex contagion that I described in my other paper, it is not working. We just might not be able to estimate it well. I think there are more serious ramifications if you're like an actual policymaker, or imagine like you're a dictator and you want to try to figure out if the protests are going to get big or not. You know, then this would suggest you can be in a world where your models just aren't going to work. But substantively, it's still an open question.
Yeah, so building on that, I mean, one of the things that really stood out to me in the paper is that there are these nuggets of really thought-provoking theory and modeling. And I had some suggestions on how you could maybe bring that more to the front and center, and I think engage with some of the questions that have already emerged head on. I think that you could frame your paper very specifically as, you know, this is about how protest size is a function of network connections and randomness. So there's, you know, these two variables that you're looking at, and one you can model in terms of networks, and the other one is this stochastic element. And both of those give you really interesting predictions about when and how you would expect protests to grow. I did write down, you know, looking at figure 1, you know, does, you know, this power law really matter? And this is something that was raised already. And I think that you really directly engage how our predictions of protest change if we see sort of this like you said, growth that isn't somehow dependent on the existing size of the protest. I think putting that front and center would really help. And then building on that in sections 3.2 and 3.3 of the paper, I mean, maybe what you could do is sort of reframe up front what you're saying to really focus on how, yes, we have all of these other theories of why protest happens and when, but perhaps those are all occurring under this larger umbrella of network structure. And that overarching all of these other theories is this question of how are people connected to each other, and sort of when and where does randomness sort of catalyze growth in that. And I think maybe the one question I'd like to hear you speak to more is something that I think that's buried quite deeply in the paper, but is really interesting. This idea that the steepness of scaling is sort of a function of the kind of repression that is already out there. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe you know, thinking about, is that one dimension of this answer, you know, why should we care about power function? Does thinking about you know, your results in a repression context help us better understand when and where we see large growth of protests?
Zach.
So Elaine, you're asking like kind of about this why I think repressive states should have a steeper slope, or the implications of the steeper slope for repressive states?
I mean, I think maybe a little bit of both, but I mean, for our audience, I think it would be great for you to touch on that concept which you present in the paper, because I think it's really interesting. And then, you know, to think, you know, I don't know, I guess my sense is that, you know, you're talking about this feedback between a repression environment and then the actual kind of protest that happens. And yeah, I guess just talk more about how you think that steepness of scaling fits in, and what the implications would be for what we see on the ground.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, I think that the slope is steeper because the more oppressive a regime is, the quicker they are to arrest or forbid any sort of gathering, no matter how large, right? And so sometimes maybe they'll fail and you get a protest of 200 or 300, but it looks like most of the time they're successful, right? And so we say, oh, these regimes are very stable because protests never get large until they do, and they explode and the regime isn't stable, right? This is 1989, this is 2011, this is like what a revolution is. So my first thought was that if we had a reliable way to measure protest in a country, then we could have annual, quarterly, monthly, who knows, measures of repression that don't rely kind of on subject matter expertise or these ordinal scales based on constitutions or whether there's a state of emergency or anything like that. So we might have a measure with more fealty to what repression actually means. We could also then maybe quantify where we think protests will be most surprising, which is to say, like, if North Korea has an alpha of like 8 and the United States has an alpha of like 1.6 or 2 or whatever, we're going to be more surprised when there's a protest, a large protest in North Korea than in the United States. My hunch for why the steepness of the slope then means there'll be a huge protest or huge protest later is that the regime is responding to all these like short-term pressures. Anytime 4 nodes get activated, anytime 10 nodes get activated, just repress it right away. But that doesn't change the underlying long-term process that causes 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 nodes to be ready to mobilize as soon as everyone else mobilizes. So they're short-term strong and long-term weak.
Charles.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed reading this paper. It was really provocative. I think, and Elaine was getting at this a little bit, I felt that there was a little bit of bombast in some of the writing, which I appreciated. But I wanted to ask a question, actually, and my comments are kind of conditional on it. Who do you have in mind as your audience for this piece?
Quantitative political scientists who study repression.
Okay, so casting a really wide net. I thought, well, I wonder, so part of the problem that I had when reading the piece is that there seemed this fundamental tension where so I'm coming at this not with a lot of network knowledge, a couple workshops from like PaulNet and that's it, right? And, but I think that I'm core to the community that you're trying to address in some way. And I kept trying to recover the substantive punchline, right? The contributions, why I should care, from amidst the technical details. And I think that I got closer to that after your presentation. I understand that a lot better. But I'm thinking about Elaine's comments in one way that you might be able to kind of flesh out the substance, right? When you're thinking about the network structure stuff, and that's having a more kind of deliberate dialogue with existing models, right? So like revolutionary cascade models, tipping models, that kind of stuff, right? Because some of the randomness that you fixate on in certain parts of the paper seems to be explained by just perturbations in those actual revolutionary thresholds, right? So if someone has a really bad day, they flip over to having a lower level at which they're willing to express opposition to the regime, and then the cascade takes off, right? So I wanted to see some kind of nod back to that, and relatedly some more like proper nouns throughout, right? Relating this to actual processes on the ground. So there's a paragraph here and there where you actually do this, but just as a repression person, I felt a little unmoored from the paper and found it hard to have kind of a mental dialogue with it at times. But really enjoyed reading it. So I'll that stuff I think can easily be addressed. But I do think that it points that attention of like how much tech you want to introduce in the manuscript as opposed to having it in the appendix. So anyway, I was curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this paper might be better as 2 or 3 papers. There is kind of a lot that's going on. Even more narrow than what I told you, quantitative social political scientists studying repression, is that I think there's a repression dissent puzzle paper in here, right? We all get to write those papers. And so I think that I could explain some of the contradictory findings as a function of the actual distribution, right? It's not that we don't have enough protests from, or we don't have enough data from regimes with hereditary inheritance, with youth bulges that are facing current account deficits, or choose your structural explanation. I think that there might be a fundamental limit to our knowledge implied by the network-driven process, and that's revealed in the empirics. So I think that would be right now the narrowest paper that I could see branching off from this. I also think there's a paper on the role of ICTs and protest size. I tried talking to Niels about this at Peace Science because he's got really good data on internet penetration. But anyway, the point is I think the slope should become flatter as we see greater internet or cell phone penetration in a country, and getting variation on that IV on penetration is very hard. In terms of talking to existing models that are out there, yeah, I completely see this as a complement to Quran. I don't think this is telling something that Quran isn't aware of and doesn't speak to. I mean, he talks about preferences being distributed in a way that we can't see, right? That's why they're falsified. That's why they're hidden. So I think this is a perfect complement to Quran, and it's very similar to David Siegel's work on repression and mobilization in networks and his modeling. And he actually he calls it an opinion leader network, but he has a scale-free network, but he just looks at the average diffusion size, which is similar to what I'm looking at, but not quite the same. He doesn't look at the distribution of the diffusions for each of his simulations, and his models are more complex than what I'm interested in. So I definitely see engagement with these models that we know in our literature.
I have Camber and then Arthur.
So I was thinking that one way, so several of the questions so far I think have kind of been versions of the so what question. Right? Mm-hmm. Why do we care if you convince us that this is a power law? I think one other way to think about why we should care is that this may be a signature of certain kinds of underlying generative mechanisms. And in fact, I think the reason a lot of the statistical physics community is most interested in this is that it excludes a lot of generative mechanisms. In particular, equilibrium-based mechanisms are nearly impossible to use to generate these sorts of extreme distributions because these correlations tend to kind of cross-balance out. They kind of come out in the wash instead of reinforcing each other. So I think this helps potentially to identify and exclude classes of generative mechanisms that could be consistent with these power law outcomes. And as I understand it, that's kind of what you're trying to do with this network model in the paper, is to show that we can perhaps provide evidence of this linkage between network structure and the power laws and protest sizes by showing in the network model that if we start with power law preferential attachment in the network structure, that we also get power laws in the protest sizes. I think this is a really interesting idea, but it's not yet fully convincing because the network models don't vary the network structure, if I understand it right. They keep this constant coefficient on the degree of preferential attachment in the network. If instead you systematic network structure underlying those and you showed the tail of the network structure is more shallow, you also get a more shallow tail in the size of protests. This, I think, would be much more convincing evidence that there's an actual theoretical linkage here, right? My question before about maybe this is just protein networks and earthquakes. If the model showed that systematic variation in network tails produced systematic variation in the tails of the protest sizes, I think that would start to provide a more convincing answer to that sort of question.
Yeah, I agree. The network results I showed you are, we call the function experiment 1 in our code. Experiment 2 varies the scaling parameter. I have a bug where when the parameter gets like below 1.5, the networks don't even get instantiated. So as soon as we figure that out, we're going to vary the scaling parameter. And then we're also going to introduce a repression parameter for experiment 3. So then we vary both scaling and then how often. So yeah, that's definitely on the to-do list.
Arthur.
Yeah, so one of the reasons that models which don't use power laws are popular is because even if the assumptions are wrong, the mechanisms by which we make inferences are very straightforward. And so, for example, the great majority of work that's done in empirical social science is in the framework of either the linear model or a generalized linear model, in which we have a very tight understanding of how some particular variable is affecting, whether it's causal or not, who knows, but is affecting some outcome. And we can talk about coefficients, and we can talk about statistical significance, and then we can talk about correcting for things that we're worried about, and so on. So where does analyzing power law relationships leave us in terms of that statistical machinery? So certainly it's very hard to talk about covariate effects. It's very hard to talk about controlling for things. Instead, this paper has a slightly unusual form in which basically it's saying, we observe this relationship in the world. Can we write down a theoretical model which could give rise to that relationship? Yes, we can. And then can I test variations of that, in a normal statistical framework where I have things like p-values? And the answer is not really. I mean, you can compare with distributional checks, one distribution against another, but it's very hard now to talk about effects of things. And I wonder if part of the challenge here is trying to give a sort of generalized linear version of these power law type relationships. And if you can't do that, I think it's worth acknowledging that trade-off, right? So the average political scientist, or the average empirical person, it would be reasonable for them to say, I want to talk about effects, right? And I want to compare, these two different covariate profiles. And if your answer to that is, well, you can't really do that, I feel that's sort of very unsatisfying. And so that should be kind of borne in mind in terms of trying to sell this work.
Yeah, no.
Oh, wait. We have a two-finger from Camber.
I just wanted to say real quick, I'm not sure that is a necessary characteristic of these sorts of power law statistics. I don't see any reason, for instance, you couldn't split samples as we do in our own paper and estimate tail index for both samples and use that to determine whether the difference that you use to split the samples on is influencing the tail index. Using a tail index rather than a mean, I don't think eliminates the possibilities of parametric inferences.
Yeah, so Camber, Lars Erik, and Didier was the other co-author on that, right? Have the best paper I've seen where they still use power laws in an empirical way, and they do exactly the process that Camber just described. I'll say Gleditsch and there's Shalizi is the last. Anyway, they have the terrorism papers, and they also show how the tail index varies by time or weapon type. There's still absolutely a quantitative approach that you can take, but then going beyond just the tail index, so long as alpha is greater than 2, our effects as means. If we have a model that is going to predict how many people protest, people are killed in a massacre, as long as we're talking about averages, we can still use our inferential statistics and talk about statistical significance. But we could say this model is closer than this other model. It gets our model closer, which is much actually closer to kind of the machine learning to classification accuracy than what we do now. Is if alpha is less than 2, if it's between 1 and 2, and you can't use mean statistics or variance statistics. That's something that I'm through and trying to figure out. Like maybe I don't know what the distribution of alpha itself is. Does alpha follow a power law? Does alpha follow a normal distribution? Can we estimate alpha for a country for a particular time period? That's an open question. It's a little frustrating because the people who've written most on this are like applied statisticians or these kind of applied finance people, and they aren't as concerned with these causal mechanisms as we are. So they haven't discussed tests and implications for statistics as much as scientists we care about. So I'm trying to work on that and figure that out, but that's definitely an open question for when alpha is less than 2. No exponent, yeah.
I I've got 2 fingers from Arthur, and then Elaine.
Go ahead, yeah.
So I just wanted to push on this. I'm curious as to what it means to say, we could compare. So I assume, and maybe it's more a question for Camber, right, that the issue here is that one is thinking about it from the perspective of we're going to kind of stratify on some covariate and then compare the power law over here where the covariates are different to the power law over there. So I'm curious as to how the link function is then set up, and is that a linear link? I mean, or is it just a non-parametric comparison of the means? I mean, I don't know that literature, and I'm very curious as to why that's close to a generalized linear model setup.
So I think what we did on was, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
What we did was pretty limited. We just took the tail index, which is a basic index for heavy-tailed distributions of how fat the tail is, how much extreme events maintain finite probability. And we showed that this tail index was different in 2 subsamples of wars. If you wanted to do a significance test for that, one of the things I'm working on in some working papers right now are permutation tests for that, or also in principle bootstrapping. Both are ways where you can resample your underlying distribution and see how likely it is that you would have gotten a tail index this large. So then you're just doing a straight non-parametric comparison between 2 sides of tail index, and if you need a p-value, you can use resampling to decide if that's a large difference in tail indexes.
I appreciate the clarification. I think we were speaking at slightly cross purposes, but I appreciate the clarification.
Elaine, is yours a 2-finger or 1-finger?
This is a pivot, so this is a 1-finger.
Okay, so hold it, and then we've got Charles on the 2-finger.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that this conversation among the 3 of you really highlights, I guess, one of the difficulties that I had as kind of an applied reader going through this, right? I ultimately wanted to know, like, how does this like weaponize my research and make it better, right? Like how can I like attack the questions I care about with this paper? And I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And I can, I guess, envision it a little bit better after this conversation, but I think that clearly outlining that would be really, really helpful for people that are core to your audience.
Yeah, Charles, that sets up my comments really well. I actually wrote down here, think of audience and lead with a hook for people like Charles. I think I want to come back to your comment, Zach, about how you actually see a couple different papers in here. And talk kind of about the substance and how I see them being chunked out, and then maybe structuring it so that it best highlights the content of each part of your argument. I really see your main paper about being about protest dynamics specifically, so moving away from kind of the grand theory of power laws. So focus specifically on how the model relates to our understanding of protest dynamics and networks with that component of randomness. When I got to section 5.1.1, I felt like I finally got to some of the theory that I was hoping for in section 3. So section 3 says it's about theory, but right now it's mostly about, or maybe it was section 2, but it says that it's theory, but it actually is basically presenting your model. And I really want to hear theory of protest before you present the model so that I believe the model when you tell me how you did it. And I finally felt like I started to get that in the beginning of section 5. The other thing about that paper that's more targeted on protests is I think you could really, and I'm assuming that you plan to do this, but bulk out the actual data that you have in section 4 and really highlight that more, because this is where we get to the hook of how does this relate to the real world and how does it tell us something new. And I guess the question that I have for you, building off of that, which maybe you can address, is, how much do you candidly think that that data, that real world data that you have, supports the model that you've developed and some of the synthetic results that you ran in the previous sections? Because when we see that, you talk about how well most of the results seem to support this power law, but you see that the Arab Spring may follow some sort of log normal distribution. So when and where do you think that this law should apply more than others, and why? And this comes back to Camber's first question about, when, is this, like, what actually are you capturing here with this model? Is it an omitted variable, or is it about some kind of randomness that is either inherent to protest or something larger? I see a second paper being more specifically about repression and the relationship between protest and repression. I think if you go too far down that avenue in your first paper, actually detracts from the model and what you're trying to demonstrate about protest specifically. And I would actually suggest dialing down your assertion that response to repression is to some degree random. I wondered in reading that and reading the literature that you cited that says, well, in some cases repression is successful, other cases it isn't. To what extent is that stochastic, and to what extent is that an omitted variable that we just haven't understood yet? And why should I believe that randomness will explain everything? So I would dial that back a little bit, or think about how you could differentiate between stochasticity and omitted variables. And then, yeah, you can have a third paper that moves more towards this grand theory and saying, hey, this power law doesn't just apply to protests, but it applies in these other spaces relevant to political science as well. And isn't that interesting? But if you're going to do that paper, I would suggest engaging more about how does social diffusion or social networks play into things like terrorism or conflict, because I think that leap is a lot clearer for protest than in some of these other phenomena. And so I'd want to see you build out the theory and really connect the dots there as well. So those are my three chunks. And I guess in terms of what you'd comment on, feel free to comment on any of it, but I'm also really interested in hearing you talk more about your real data and, to what extent you think the data that you have supports what you're modeling more theoretically.
Cool. Yeah, I'm writing that down. And then I'll respond. Okay, great. So the data I've presented here, the section 4 data, do not directly test the mechanism, right? They show the outcomes, and they suggest the outcomes follow a pattern that we would think if the mechanism exists, but I'm not testing that mechanism here. I really want to test that mechanism. So something that I think I'm looking for, like a grad student who's got a lot of time. Anyway, is that I have my Twitter data, and I can get this scaling exponent at a city level or a country level. And from IQs, or also maybe from my data. Anyway, I can get protest data as well. And so I could empirically see if there's a connection between these two things that much more closely matches the model. So that'd be the better test to answer your question, because right now the data that I have don't test the mechanisms. And then you asked about what do I think in some cases where the power law appears to hold, and others that it doesn't. And the short answer is I think that's really interesting, something I need to think about more as well. So for some of these phenomena, you don't have stable mean or variance. For some, you just have stable variance. And then for some others that I've looked at, maybe ACLED or maybe CAL's like Civil War data, some of these conflict data that I've looked at say that you have a log normal distribution. So does the extent of the heavy-tailedness tell us something about the underlying process? Probably, but then like when we get the alpha that's between 1 and 2 and 2 to 3, and what that precisely tells us about the social network mechanism or the positive feedback mechanism is something that I'm still thinking about and want to figure out.
Great, and I just want to follow up on that with an extra thought or suggestion. in terms of kind of helping your audience follow along with, I guess, the logic of how these different events might play out, I would encourage you to think or to be more explicit in really defining what the events are that you're talking about. So what is on your x-axis? Because right now in the paper, even when we're looking just at protest, there seems to be some movement back and forth between talking about the frequency of protest, of any kind of protest, and then the size of the protest. So for example, section 2 talks more about protest frequency, section 3 talks about protest size, and then sections 4 and 5 talk about both of those things. And I can definitely see how the two are related, but they're actually conceptually different entities. So talking about why we would expect any protest to happen kind of emerging out of networks and randomness is a slightly different conversation than talking about why we'd expect any given protest that does happen to be bigger or smaller. And so then when you're thinking about applying that to questions like conflict or terrorism, that I give that comment threefold more. You know, when we're talking about terrorism events, are we talking about casualties? Are we talking about the number of events themselves? Number of people involved? Just be explicit so that we can kind of think more concretely about what's actually happening there on our x-axis.
I have Camber next.
So I just wanted to point out, I think it's also important to remember that I think sometimes the paper gets into a little trouble in making too absolute a distinction between these different distributional forms. These log normal, power laws, etc., aren't things that actually exist in reality, right? They're ideal types that statisticians have used to describe these things. And empirical distributions always deviate in various ways from these ideal types. I think I'll send some citations in an email later. There's some really interesting papers by Sornet and other co-authors where they show that deviations, small deviations from the power law form can actually contain more information about the underlying generative mechanisms. So you might actually have an easier time if you placed less emphasis on whether or not it was log normal or power law, talked in more general terms about heavy tails, and argue that you can argue that you have a model that reproduces those heavy tails without actually needing to assign a proper noun to the tail. I think that might allow you to kind of sidestep some of these issues.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Arthur.
Yeah, it's a very direct follow-on to that, really, which is to say that, you know, in general, right, the data generating process is very noisy, and trying to say that it fits this particular distribution very well is obviously an issue for the reasons that Camber suggests. But actually, I'd go further. I'd say, you know, you're always going to be open to the critique that what you're really modeling is the way that news sources report the data, right? And maybe they have some power law reason to want to report it that way, or maybe that's just the way that data arrives to them in the real world. And so if you really want to get into modeling what gives rise to the distribution, you'd also have to add this noisy process in which there's a network on the ground doing things, and there's a network of news reporters who see certain nodes and not other nodes, and so on and so forth. And I think that would be sometimes a more realistic model of what it is that you're modeling at the end of the day. But if you're going that route, then you're kind of acknowledging that it's this weird, noisy process, and then that should also encourage you to move away from these idealized types, I think.
I agree about the newspaper point. So that's kind of, this paper started back in February when Erica Chenoweth and Jeremy Pressman released their crowd counting consortium data. Anyway, and I was like, oh, well, I have GPS tagged tweets that I can use to count the number of GPS tagged accounts that are at these protests, and use that to verify newspaper attendance data. And they correlate very well with the numbers reported in newspapers, and I have more belief in the external validity of the count from my GPS tagged tweets versus what newspapers report. Elsewhere, I didn't show in this paper, I look at the scaling parameter for the Women's Day March according to GDELT, because IQ's is on a 1-year delay, so I can't use it. And GDELT actually reports a steeper slope, so less fat tails actually, which is probably, I think that's a function of like a finite amount of space in the newspaper, and so they can't just like talk about these big protests forever. But the verified data from Twitter still reveal a scaling relationship, and it is almost identical to what CCC, the crowd counting consortium, finds. And Camber, I like your point about just calling it heavy tail. I think that's a nice framing.
I have an open queue.
So yeah, as we can tell from you know all this talking, I have a lot of ideas I want to work with here, and I feel like there are a lot of projects. This working paper is kind of just the first draft and the start of it. And you know, I always go back and forth on how early to send stuff out, but I wanted to send this out and get feedback and see what people think. So everything y'all have said are things that I've thought about and agree with, and you know, we'll work on and, you know, hopefully get publications and tenure from.
Elaine.
Yeah, Zach, I had one other thought. So the section 3.2 talks about random sparks, but I would suggest sort of reframing that section, or maybe building it out to really be about, you know, the fact that some plans catch and other plans don't. So not to get bogged down in the side argument with other authors, but really engage with the question of, you know, is it really random? The kind of the times when that planning sort of catches and gains momentum, or is there sort of, are there omitted factors to the planning which we're not capturing yet? But I really like that use of the random spark imagery, and to just think about you know, putting that maybe a little bit more front and center, especially as we're thinking about how you can ground it back in the question of why does this matter? You know, this idea that there's kind of this latent potential for protest in a much broader range of situations, and there's some sort of element of randomness to which ones catch and which ones don't.
Yeah. So that's similar to what you were saying about omitted variables earlier. A dogmatic person, like if you read Mandelbrot, who's kind of the father of all this, going back to the 60s and 70s, would say that the distribution shows that it's not an omitted variable issue, because by having that slope, you know, it doesn't matter whether we have better data on the social network composition, or we wait 500 years and we see 1,000 more revolutions. You know, it's still going to have an infinite mean or variance. Perhaps it says something about the data collection process, kind of getting to what Arthur was talking about, but it wouldn't suggest an omitted variable.
Yeah, and I think that that's what makes it really interesting. You know, the idea that there isn't something out there that we haven't measured yet, but there is some degree of randomness and unpredictability about where it's going to catch and where not. And I think that sort of does shift how political scientists might think about when and where protests happen.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's what I want to get at. Yeah.
Camber.
Yeah, just to build quickly on that point, I think that you've got one of the most interesting, you know, if you want to think about empirical implications of this, right? This might matter because it teaches us something new about protest. I thought one of your most interesting gestures towards an empirical implication at the end was about the temporal dynamics of protest acceleration. You suggest that if your underlying mechanism is correct, we should see shifting tail structures over the course of a mobilization event as it accelerates. I think that's really interesting and relates closely to some papers by Johnson et al. I'll send some citations that have They model a model of what they call Red Queen dynamics, where they show progress curves over the course of an insurgency. So you might actually, I think, be able to, that prediction can actually be made even more specific. It's not just that we would see the kind of acceleration, but the shape of the acceleration actually has a predictable form according to those models.
Yeah, the Johnson and Poe Horquist team, they're like the group of people I still need to read more of. I have their stuff in my feed, but yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank you so much, Zachary, for sharing your paper with us. And thank you to Ritter, Camber, Charles, and Elaine for spending the time reading it and giving us great comments, and I really appreciate it. This is the end of the semester for the OPSC, and we've opened the call for papers. So if anybody has a paper they want to send, please send it to me, Emily Ritter, at eritter@ucmerced.edu, or pssonlinecolloquia@gmail.com, and we'll try to get you in the spring. So thanks so much, everybody.
All right, thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.